Hello everyone, good to see you all. Hope you're well. And today we're going to talk in this lecture about the much debated Anglo-Irish Treaty. And this is the treaty, as you mentioned, which is finally going to bring a halt to all this conflict. It's going to be signed in 6th of December 1921. And of course, is going to be incredibly contentious, the most contentious document, as well as one of the most historic documents in modern Irish history, because, as we'll see, we end up, of course, with this huge division in the Sinn Féin movement, and then we end up with a civil war that's going to follow on from that, and great bitterness and debate and documentaries and we'll go films made about this for many years to come. But let's say it's not unexpected. The war is, not really going anywhere. I say it's this stalemate. It's awful for both sides. It's just dreadful, and you have a feeling, I say, whatever the result, there was going to be some kind of sit down, and this, I say, is finally it. And we mentioned last time the fact that, I say, Sinn Féin themselves, the leadership, certainly approached the sort of search for a permanent settlement in a kind of relaxed manner, which may be surprising. And we talked about some of the reasons for that. And I see some of the implications of the fact that, I say, the country looks as if it's somehow, it's been a Sinn Féin victory because, say, the IRA everywhere, Sinn Féin local government is established and so on, which are all, I'd say, hostages to fortune going forward. So it's not actually until October 1921 that formal negotiations actually get underway. And I say there are other reasons which add to the delay. Lloyd George, for example, has this idea of holding the talks in a secluded Scottish castle near Inverness, which is, I suppose, a fair idea. Get away from the glare of the publicity and so on. You can hammer everything out there. That falls through. So eventually they're switched to London now, right in the heart of London. And they begin on the 11th of October and will last, as I say, around 2 months or so. Now, there's a number of key things, of course, which again, of course, a lot of debate and controversy over the years about these negotiations. And I mean, one of them, of course, is De Valera's refusal or his decision not to attend, and to send instead a group of plenipotentiaries. So he doesn't go. Now that's kind of odd because because Lloyd George is there as the head of the British government. You think he would maybe be there leading this delegation, but he sends these plenipotentiaries now, who have, of course, as plenipotentiaries, have the right to sign treaties and so on behalf of the government. And this very controversial move will be of massive significance later on, considering, of course, his own later hostility to the agreement. And he'll be able to say that, he wasn't party to this agreement. He didn't sign the agreement and can therefore disagree with it. And a number of people have suggested, various things. One is that De Valera's reaction to the treaty, going against the treaty after it's signed, comes from a kind of wounded vanity, if you like, that, it wasn't his compromise. And there was a compromise made and he wasn't at the table, therefore he's going to reject it because it wasn't actually his. I don't know if there's a great deal in that. Some have said, of course, that he never wanted to be party to any kind of compromise, and he knew compromise was inevitable. Because, of course, he'd sat down with Lloyd George. He'd get a fair understanding that the Republic, the full Republic, is just not, it's just off the table. There's going to have to be some give and take. And he didn't want it to be his compromise. Maybe there's something more in that. I mean, his argument, of course, De Valera makes, is that he believes he's best to stay at home to shore up support for the truce and the ongoing negotiations amongst the volunteers. Of course, and he's very popular with the volunteers. They really do respect De Valera. And to be fair, that is what De Valera is doing in this period when the negotiations are going on. You can see lots of inspections, and he's out in the west of Ireland now, just to keep tempers calm in case they do start another shooting war and so on. So he is doing what he says he's doing. Again, and I say you can argue this kind of back and forward. It's usually people who hate De Valera say he was doing something else. People who have more sympathy for him say it's actually quite a shrewd move. This leave him in reserve, as it were, above the fray, and then he maybe can step in at the end with some kind of compromise. Again, who knows? Now, as I say, one of the issues is there's going to be an inevitable compromise on the demand for a full republic. That's just not happening. It's never going to happen because you always have to give and take. Both sides will. In a letter to an American supporter, De Valera did say that it was his intention. This is a quote from him: "Intention to balance the delegation to a point where it was almost paralysed." It's a very strange, cryptic thing to say. So I think the point, what people have taken out of that, is that what De Valera was doing was putting on the delegation itself enough people who he knew so enough moderates and enough hardliners, as it were, so that they would end up not being able to agree and eventually refer it back to him. And therefore, then he could be the final arbiter, maybe, of the decision. But again, books have been written about all of this, and you could argue long into the night about exactly what De Valera is kind of up to. And as I say, it's more kind of glaring because if you look at the delegations, you can see the British field a really top level delegation. I mean, Lloyd George, Prime Minister, say Lord Birkenhead, Winston Churchill. I mean, you couldn't find any more real top people in the British establishment than these. This is their first 11, if you like. This really is. And on the Sinn Féin side, of course, I mean, the two major figures on the Sinn Féin side are, without doubt, Arthur Griffith and Michael Collins. Very peculiar again, Arthur Griffith, suddenly sitting in Downing Street. Well, he's a very strange, charmed life when it comes to his role in this Irish Revolution. But he's there, quite a moderate figure. And Michael Collins, of course. And believed that Collins was chosen because he was someone who's had these relationships with the hardliners. He's the head of the IRB, has lots of contacts. He could maybe as well keep things calm, I say, amongst the radicals and the Republicans back home. And really what happens is, in these negotiations as time goes on, that once the broad framework of the agreement is worked out, you then get to the nitty gritty. And usually how it works is Griffith and Collins usually break off, and they will meet usually with Lloyd George and Churchill, or Lloyd George and Birkenhead, in a more kind of cosy arrangement. And that's where the real kind of deals are going to be done. And I say they are plenipotentiaries, so they can sign this thing. But De Valera does provide them with rather admittedly vague instructions to submit any final draft agreement back to Dublin for the cabinet to look at, him and the full cabinet to look at, and then they can sign. Now, as I've said, the fact that Sinn Féin have chosen to attend the negotiations inevitably means there's going to be compromise on this separatist Republican demand. And as I said, they start off with a long series of big debates, as it were, like everyone's around the table, where they lay out their positions. Now, the issue is not in this debate. Most of the key things are actually organised very quickly, or what we would think of maybe as more key things, practical things, about financing and policing and the military and all that stuff. That's not actually the issue. The British are happy to give all these practical powers to the new state. But the issue seems to be, and where the sticking point is on the issue of the relationship of this new state to the British Empire. That's the problem. That's the fundamental issue. What the British want, of course, they're not going to give a republic, because they want a retention now of some kind of royal authority, like the Dominions have, with the creation, say, of a Governor General, and also an oath of allegiance taken to the monarch by what will be TDs or MPs, representatives now going to this new parliament, will have to take this oath now. So they want, as it were, a veneer of this kind of imperial link between both sides. And that's really where the sticking point is. It's very peculiar, the treaty. The treaty is not, in many ways, about substantive issues. It's about constitutional symbols. That's where the problem lies. And De Valera himself had sort of, in his own typical De Valera way, which is, I say, very abstract. He's a very abstract thinker, very mathematical thinker. But he has this idea of what he calls external association. And this is the idea that Ireland would be associated with the empire on matters of common concern. And the king, therefore the monarch, would be relegated to the position, not as it were of being king of Ireland, if you like, but being king of the association rather than the state itself. It's a very strange idea. So you've got basically two countries now, and you've got, I say, a monarch, the king. You've got the king of Britain, and then in this is to be also the monarch, the head of state over Ireland as well. De Valera has this idea that no, they're independent, but they have these links, this association on various issues, and the king will be in charge of the link, not the state itself. It's very obscure, this, and very abstract, and I don't know if most people could even understand what he's trying to say. But as I say, it's that's De Valera's way around it, and we'll see the same thing, by the way, during the treaty debates. He'll come up with another peculiar solution to this, which again no one else understands, somehow to hold the two sides together. But it is remarkable, as I say, it's about constitutional issues. It's not about, who's going to run post offices and, how many police officers you can have and how big your army can be. That's not an issue. Currency and all that. It's about whose flag is flying, from what building and so on. Now, here is the treaty, of course, the famous signature page, the end of the treaty itself, finally, and you can see all the signatures there. And I say it's going to be signed now in the early hours of the 6th of December 1921. And what the treaty offers Ireland is essentially full fiscal autonomy, basically dominion status. Now, so it will be like an Australia or a Canada or something like that. I say right to create its own military and so on. The state itself is to be styled as the Irish Free State. Now, it's called the Irish Free State. I mean, this is actually a concession from Lloyd George. Rather than call it the Irish Dominion or something, which they don't like at all, he says, oh, we'll call it the Irish Free State then, and give you even more kind of distance and independence, if you like. And I say a remarkable degree of independence. The British don't insist on the reservation of rights over really any of the internal workings of the new state. So again, this looks like full independence now, even though you might have these, I say, like Australia, even as today, you kind of got a governor general and the kind of thin veneer, as I say, of kind of imperialism. However, there are also, though, some rather peculiar restrictions attached to this dominion status. And I just want to mention a few of these. One is the retention by the British of access to a number of naval installations in the west of Ireland. These are the so-called treaty ports. Now, the reason they keep these is for strategic reasons. So obviously to protect the vital Atlantic trade routes and so on. And in war, of course, be very, very important. Now, it doesn't mean the British occupy these ports or whatever. It just means they use the naval installations as they always had done. So they can bring ships in and out and refit them and send them out and so on. But yeah, it's a nominal, as I say, force of occupation or anything. You wouldn't really notice, as it were, a great deal of British personnel in these ports. So that's one thing. Of course, these ports themselves will be given away infamously in 1938 as part of Neville Chamberlain's appeasement strategy. In order to appease, he's appeasing everybody, appeases the Irish by saying, okay, we'll withdraw completely from the treaty ports, which will prove almost disastrous during the Second World War to follow. And that's another one of Neville Chamberlain's wonderfully self-defeating decisions. Second thing is Irish liability for the war debt is kept. So they have to pay back the war debt. They were part of, Britain during the First World War. There's a lot of money owed, so they have to keep chipping in to pay their share of it. That's another maybe peculiarity, you could say, compared to other forms of dominion status. And as I say, the oath as well. The oath is the big thing, really. It's huge, this. They even changed the oath, actually, from the word from allegiance to fidelity. And the idea is this is going to be added to the as yet unwritten Free State Constitution, which is going to be based on this treaty. And they're going to have this oath and so on. So it's a peculiar kind of debate is going to emerge from this about the treaty, in the sense it's going to cause a civil war and so on. But fundamentally, what they're actually going to be arguing about both sides are these constitutional symbols. So it's very, very strange. Now, the most notable thing, and here's a very, very important point, which we'll talk about in much more detail later on, the issue of the North. Now, there is a great myth, of course, which, as I say, is traded around amongst, Dublin tour guides and so on. And this is the myth that during the Anglo-Irish Treaty, the British decide they're going to keep Northern Ireland, keep in inverted commas. And what causes the Civil War, therefore, is you go back with this treaty and say, oh, well, we couldn't get the whole of Ireland. They kept 6 counties of Ireland. And then other people maybe understandably say, oh, you can't lose part of Ulster. That's just wrong. And they say, oh, we could only manage, we got what we got. And sadly, both sides kind of fall out eventually over this pragmatist versus idealist thing. Nonsense. Complete nonsense. But you can see why people say that, because that's a more substantial thing to fall out over, partition. To say, well, they partition a country. I mean, we can't accept this. That's why. Not on what they actually fight about, which is the oath and the oath of allegiance. Now, what happens, what they do, the way they sidestep the North, is Northern Ireland's going to be included technically within this overall agreement. But is also then given the option to opt out if they made a request to the king within a month of the ratification of this new Free State. So they have basically a month, the Ulster month it's called. So they can opt out. What's wonderful about it is they do that the next morning. It's quite funny. They're so desperate to get out. Don't leave it a month. It's like anything in life, isn't it? You've got a bill to pay. I'll pay it next week. No. James Craig straight on the boat. We're out completely. And the way they sidestep this, because Sinn Féin are well aware that the Ulster issue, the partition issue, is a weak point for the British. If they keep pushing on this, if this is what they go to the press with, De Valera tells them, if you're going to break on the issue of Ulster. Because you could say that to the press. Well, we can't sign any agreement which is going to divide the country and so on. But what they end up doing is, I say they sidestep it with the solution of a boundary commission. And I'll just show you here now. In Article 12 of the Anglo-Irish Treaty, this is an article which is full of very dangerous ambiguity. And what it states is that the way they're going to deal with the partition issue is that at an unspecified time, sometime in the future, when, a commission is going to sit, and it's going to be made up of northern and southern members. So you're going to have one from north, one from the south, with an impartial chairperson in the middle. And they're going to together readjust the border between north and south. They're going to redraw the line, as it were, so that it better reflects, as you can see, in accordance with the wishes of the inhabitants. So, there's lots of Catholics, as it were, who were stuck in the north and the border area. You're going to say, well, you can, in South Armagh, say, Newry and places like that. Yeah, we'll draw the border there and you can be in the south. If there's lots of Protestants, say, as there are in East Donegal, well, we'll draw the border and you can come into the northern state. So they're going to rationalise the border, essentially. And now, the addition, though, in this of a caveat, as you can see, I'll just read the whole thing. So the British government shall determine in accordance with the wishes of the inhabitants. Well, that's fine, isn't it? Whatever. Referendums or plebiscites or something. Have a vote. Do you want this side? Agree on this side or that side? But here's the little typical Lloyd George kind of get out here. So far as may be compatible with economic and geographic conditions. Now, what does that mean? I mean, that is a wonderfully ambiguous phrase. What does that actually mean? It's hard to say. So it's saying, yeah, we'll decide on the wishes of the inhabitants as long as it kind of fits in with the geography of the whole thing and the economy of the whole thing. So it's incredibly vague, this treaty. And as we'll see, what will happen is, with all the civil war and all this convulsions to come, the Boundary Commission will not actually come to sit until 1924 into 1925. When all of this stuff has happened, Lloyd George will be out of office by then. And all they're going to be left with, these commissioners, are going to be this paragraph, essentially. Because, of course, it doesn't tell you anything. It doesn't tell you how you're going to gain the wishes of the inhabitants. Are you going to do census figures or something? How are you going to do that? Are you going to votes? It doesn't say how much area is going to be involved in these transfers. It's all incredibly vague. It's remarkable to think this is, essentially going to be an international boundary, which is going to be decided by this kind of moth-eaten set of tools. Now, the thing about this, of course, is, and this is again the sort of evil genius of Lloyd George. He gives the impression to someone like Arthur Griffith now to say that there's going to be lots of territory involved because there's lots of Catholics, of course. So, and I'll give you, here's a typical, rather fanciful idea of what Southerners may expect to get if there is a redrawing of the northern boundary. So you can see the darker areas are areas they expect, which are lots of Catholics in these areas. And so the new border would be, as I say, round that darker grey area there. So that would be essentially what? The counties of Fermanagh, Tyrone, big chunks of Londonderry, including Derry City, and South Armagh, South Down around Newry. That's a big, big chunk of territory. And it allows them to sell that, and he doesn't discourage them in this. Whilst at the same time, he's able to say to James Craig, oh, don't worry too much about this. All we're talking about really is a kind of rationalisation of the border, because it's very long and ponderous, and you'll probably get some people back yourself, if we trim this. We're not talking about dismantling the whole state. So they leave this whole thing up in the air now. One thing you would say about this, and I think this is a very, very important point, is that it means that by accepting the Boundary Commission clause, Sinn Féin are accepting partition. Think about it that way. Because, you see, no matter how generous a Boundary Commission award would be, I mean, this is the most generous, if this had happened, you're still going to have a thing called Northern Ireland existing. Doesn't matter. You're still going to have, it's still going to be a thing, Northern Ireland. It might be completely much smaller than it is. So fundamentally, they've accepted the principle of partition in the Anglo-Irish Treaty Agreement. But what will be remarkable about all of this is when we get to the treaty debates, and I say they're throwing all kinds of mud at one another and it's getting very personal, one would imagine that someone would stand up and say, how could we sign this treaty? It gives up the North or whatever. Nothing. We have almost nothing mentioned in these very bitter debates about that, because everyone comes to accept, as I say, this idea of the Boundary Commission. And it's a constant theme in modern Irish history that Southern nationalists always prioritise the extent of their own independence over that of Irish unity. And I mean, honestly, I think we can't kid ourselves on that Southern nationalists lose sleep over partition and over the North. That is not where their priorities sit at all. Later on, of course, they will talk in this way. They will try and rationalise the Civil War and so on. That is not what people are saying at the time. And so, as I hear the delegation actually coming back, now you can see returning to Ireland after the signing of the agreement on the 6th of December. I say the agreement itself is not as complex as maybe we thought it would have been, considering all the arguments and debates back and forward. The issue, as I say, is very clearly about constitutional symbols. And that's what people are arguing about. That is what the Civil War is going to be all about. This oath to the king. I'm not you know, you imagine some Republican who's fighting down in South Tipperary. I'm not taking some oath to foreign king or whatever. That's what they're fighting about, not what we might think. So I say partition itself is going to, again, you see, be sidestepped. Isn't this the problem always? This is going right back to the Ulster crisis. People aren't facing squarely up to the fact that partition is a thing. It's, you know, you have to deal with Ulster as a thing. There's a million of Protestants in Northern Ireland. And once again, you sidestep, you put it off for later. Oh, well, somewhere down the line, there's going to be a boundary commission. So the irony of ironies of all this is that what had begun the problem, which is Ulster resistance, which had begun the process towards revolution, actually will end up being the final thing that we'll get. So I think the failure of Sinn Féin to accept the reality of partition, and not, as it were, to backpedal on their past sort of rhetorical dogmas and just say, okay, we're going to have to sit down with James Craig, talk to him and organise this, actually ends up meaning the worst of all possible worlds. And what we're going to see, and again, we'll talk about this in a later section as well, is that 1922 will be an absolute disaster. Effectively, what you have in 1922 are really two civil wars. You will have a civil war in the north, and the, I suppose, more famous civil war, which begins in the second half of 1922. Both of these states now will fall apart, will turn in on one another, and we're going to have cataclysmic levels of violence going forward. Now, next time what we'll do is, I say, we'll talk about what happens to these chaps when they come back and they return with this document, and we'll talk about reactions to the treaty and how division now about this issue is going to begin right at the top of the Sinn Féin movement. And I say, we'll talk about that cleavage and that growing division, which eventually is going to lead to, as we say, civil war going forward. Okay, see you again next time, folks.